imagine you're standing in like a massive, totally quiet room.
Okay.
And right in the center of this room is this intricate, sprawling setup of millions of dominoes. I mean, they map out Middle Eastern borders, highly fortified military installations, maritime choke points, and, complex political alliances.
Or millions of them.
Yeah, millions.
Yeah.
And you are standing at the very beginning of the line, and your finger is hovering just a millimeter above that very first piece. That piece is February 28th, 2026, the morning of the coordinated airstrikes inside Iran. Okay, let's unpack this.
Because, the fundamental rule of that room, and honestly of modern geopolitical conflict, is that the second your finger makes contact, the second that first piece falls, physics just takes over.
Right, you're not in control anymore.
Exactly. You are no longer the architect of the setup. You just become a spectator to the chain reaction.
That fraction of a second is really where theory dies and reality takes over. So today, we are taking a deep dive into the hidden mechanics of a massive, premeditated military action. We're pulling from the newly declassified SFE Puro 001 case file, but our mission isn't just to recount a timeline of explosions. We're analyzing the strategic calculus here. We really want to understand the why and the when behind those strikes on February 28th.
Before we jump into that timeline, though, I think we need to establish the ground rules for how we're approaching this material.
Definitely.
The declassified data we're examining deals with deeply sensitive geopolitical events, direct military actions, and, intense international conflict involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
Very. And I want to be entirely clear with you, the listener. We are not here to take sides. We are not endorsing any political ideology, nor are we validating any military viewpoint or foreign policy stance, left or right.
Right.
Our sole objective for this deep dive is to impartially analyze the tactical and strategic data exactly as it's presented in the file. We're looking strictly at the mechanics of statecraft and military decision-making.
Okay, so let's set the stage. It is dawn, February 28, 2026. A rapid, heavily organized, and intensely premeditated wave of strikes begins hitting specific targets inside Iranian territory. The initial data shows these strikes were heavily concentrated on critical infrastructure, so things like integrated air defense systems, specific military facilities, and highly strategic nodes.
It was a very calculated opening blow.
Yeah, but an event of this magnitude, a coordinated strike-piercing sophisticated airspace, it doesn't just materialize out of thin air on a Tuesday morning. The timeline requires us to rewind weeks, if not months, to see how this actually began in the shadows.
Yeah, because the weeks leading up to February 28th were characterized by a very deliberate, calibrated kind of tension.
What do you mean by calibrated?
Well, the Middle East was showing abnormal signs, but you really had to know where to look. The data logs from that period show a distinct, measurable increase in military activity, but it's not the kind that immediately triggers a war. We're talking about shifts in naval carrier strike groups moving closer to operational theaters, airborne early warning and control aircraft AWACS, altering their standard flight patterns to loiter just a bit closer to territorial boundaries.
Oh, I see.
And a massive spike in encrypted military communications.
It kind of reminds me of the shifting atmospheric pressure right before a massive thunderstorm.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like, if you're a meteorologist, you have all the right barometers and instruments. You can look at the data and say, oh, wow, a massive system is about to break. You know the pressure is dropping.
Right, you see the signs.
But to a regular person just, drinking their coffee and looking out their living room window, it just looks like a slightly cloudy, normal day. Nobody stood up at a podium in early February and announced, hey, we're launching a massive strike at the end of the month.
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of that atmospheric shift. In modern geopolitical strategy, this is known as operating below the public threshold.
Below the public threshold?
Yes. The signals we just mentioned, the troop movements, the shifting of naval assets, the activation of specific radar frequencies, they're intentionally designed to be recognized by the adversary's intelligence agencies.
So they want them to see it.
Exactly. It's state-to-state signaling.
But how does a state actually calibrate that? Like, how do you send a military signal that says we are ready to strike without accidentally starting the war right then and there?
It really comes down to posture versus action. For example, you might move a naval carrier group into the region, which is obviously a massive projection of power. That's the signal.
Okay.
But to keep it below the threshold, you keep the strike fighters on the deck instead of launching them into continuous combat air patrols.
Oh, wow.
You're communicating capability and intent. You are saying, I am here, I am armed, and I am willing to act.
Right.
Furthermore, diplomatic back channels shift their phrasing. They move from expressing, grave concern to stating unacceptable risks to core security. And the adversary's intelligence apparatus hears this loud and clear.
So they're essentially having a high-stakes, private conversation right in plain sight.
Precisely.
You deliberately keep it below the threshold of a formal public declaration, because the moment you cross that line into undeniable public warning, you back your adversary into a political corner.
Yes, exactly.
If you publicly announce an impending attack, you humiliate the adversary on the world stage, and that effectively forces them to launch a preemptive strike just to save face or protect their assets.
Right, you leave them no choice.
So operating below that threshold allows you to escalate pressure, test their responses, and maintain control of your own operational timeline.
And that timeline is the most critical asset a military planner has. But eventually, the diplomatic runway ends, the tension snaps.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the execution phase. The timeline zeroes in on the exact moment the operation commenced. The strikes began at dawn.
And dawn is rarely a coincidence in a kinetic operation, right? The timing is usually engineered to achieve overlapping tactical objectives. Obviously, there's the human element, like circadian rhythms are at their lowest, shift changes are happening in command bunkers, general alertness is just biologically compromised.
People are tired.
Exactly. But there are also massive technical advantages. Striking at dawn often exploits a phenomenon known as thermal crossover.
Thermal crossover is a crucial factor here. Twice a day, at dawn and dusk, the temperature of the ground and the temperature of targets like vehicles, radar installations, or missile silos, they temporarily equalize.
Wait, they equalize?
Yes. So for a brief window, infrared sensors and targeting pods have a much harder time distinguishing a target from its background.
Oh, wow.
By launching the initial wave at dawn, you are actively degrading the adversary's electro-optical and infrared defense capabilities at the exact moment your munitions are crossing the threshold.
Okay, wait. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
I'm looking at the timeline of the buildup we just discussed, and I have to push back on this traditional concept of surprise. We just established that for weeks, there was increased military activity, harsh diplomatic rhetoric, carrier groups moving into position, and nonstop intelligence chatter.
Right.
The pressure cooker was whistling so loudly that every intelligence agency on the planet knew something was imminent. If the adversary was reading all these below the public threshold signals, how on earth can a dawn strike, even with thermal crossover, rely on the element of surprise? I mean, they knew a punch was coming.
You are identifying the classic trade-off in modern warfare. Planners have to distinguish between strategic surprise and tactical surprise. You really cannot have both in a protracted geopolitical standoff.
So they effectively sacrifice strategic surprise to guarantee tactical surprise.
Precisely. Strategic surprise, the big picture that was lost weeks prior when the signaling began.
Right.
The adversary knew tensions were boiling over. They strongly suspected an attack was likely. But tactical surprise is about the microscopic details of execution.
Okay, so the when and the how.
Exactly. The adversary doesn't know exactly which morning, at exactly which minute, the first missile will cross into their airspace.
Yeah.
More importantly, they don't know the exact sequence of the attack. They don't know which specific early warning radar site will be blinded first, or which electronic warfare frequencies are going to be jammed.
It's like you can know a heavyweight fighter is going to throw a punch, but if you don't know the exact millisecond it's leaving their shoulder, or whether it's a jab to the jaw or a hook to the ribs, you are still going to take the full kinetic force of the hit.
That's a great analogy. And looking at the operational data from the initial hours, the scale and concentration of this opening blow were designed to exploit that tactical surprise to its absolute maximum.
Right.
The first wave wasn't just dropping explosives on buildings. It was a highly sophisticated effort to dismantle the adversary's integrated air defense system, or IADS.
The IADs, right?
This means using electronic warfare aircraft to flood early warning radars with false signals, followed immediately by anti-radiation missiles designed to home in on and destroy the surface-to-air missile targeting radars.
So you blind the defense grid first, so the heavier strike packages following minutes later can operate in uncontested airspace.
Exactly.
This wasn't a symbolic slap on the wrist to send a diplomatic message. It was a highly targeted, aggressive campaign meant to secure an immediate, undeniable operational advantage.
Which forces us to look beyond the tactical execution and examine the deeper internal logic of the command center.
Right.
A strike of this magnitude requires a multi-layered calculation involving national security, domestic politics, long-term regional strategy, and of course, intense time pressure.
Yeah.
The military commanders can design the perfect dawn raid, but the civilian and top-level leadership still have to give the green light.
So what does this all mean? Like, when you look at the months of buildup, the signaling, the electronic warfare, and the geopolitical fallout, is there ever an objectively perfect time to launch a strike like this?
That's the million-dollar question.
It's a textbook security dilemma, but looking at the timeline we have here, the window they had to calculate that acceptable risk was incredibly narrow.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question when analyzing military doctrine. What is the ultimate goal of hitting these specific high-value strategic targets?
Right.
The documentation forces us to look at a fundamental divergence in strategy. Was the objective merely to deter future actions by the adversary, to show them the severe cost of continued escalation? Or was it a calculated, permanent effort to fundamentally weaken and degrade the adversary's long-term military capabilities?
Deterrence versus degradation. That is a massive distinction in the rules of engagement.
Huge.
Because deterrence is essentially a warning shot. You hit a runway or an empty warehouse to say, hey, we have the capability to reach you, so back down.
Exactly.
But degradation is a kneecap.
Yeah.
You hit the research facilities, the drone manufacturing plants, the advanced centrifuge sites. You are actively removing their physical ability to fight back, regardless of whether they want to or not.
And the tactical choices on February 28th point heavily toward degradation.
They do.
And that reveals a rather sobering reality about how these massive decisions are finalized. Nation-states rarely launch coordinated strikes of this scale out of an active desire to use military force.
Yeah, the costs are too high.
The political and economic costs are simply enormous. Instead, the green light is almost always given when leaders reach a grim mathematical realization. The point where inaction carries a greater risk than action.
It's the ultimate trap of the security dilemma. From the perspective of the decision makers, they are acting out of a feeling of deteriorating security.
Yes.
They're looking at the intelligence board, looking at the adversary, actively hardening their air defense sites, dispersing their mobile missile launchers, and moving assets deep underground.
They see the window closing.
Exactly. They realize, if we let them continue to dig in, our tactical advantage disappears. If we do nothing today, we will be incapable of defending ourselves tomorrow.
The moment of decision arrives not when victory is guaranteed, but when acting provides a marginally greater strategic advantage than continuing to wait.
Right.
It is a calculus of shrinking options. The time pressure is absolute. Every single day you wait to launch that dawn strike, the adversary's defensive grid gets slightly stronger.
Wow.
You're eventually forced to choose the moment where the risk of triggering a wider war is deemed acceptable compared to the risk of facing a fully entrenched adversary later on.
So you make the choice to degrade the air defense system, but in doing so, you surrender control of the timeline, which brings us right back to our room full of dominoes.
Yes, the dominoes.
The moment that calculus tips, the moment the command is given and those electronic warfare planes cross the border, the entire paradigm shifts.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see the true physical nature of military force.
Yeah.
It is an entirely irreversible instrument. During the weeks of signaling and buildup, the leaders in the command center are the proactive masters of their strategy. They control the pace, the targets, the diplomatic messaging.
Right.
But the instant the first anti-radiation missile leaves the reel, that control just evaporates.
They immediately shift from being proactive planners to reactive participants in a crisis.
Yeah.
The friction of war takes over.
Exactly. The options available to them drastically narrow. The strike might execute perfectly, blinding the radars and hitting the targets, but they can no longer dictate how the adversary will respond.
Right, because the adversary gets a vote too.
Always.
Yeah.
Will the adversary absorb the blow, or will they launch a retaliatory swarm of ballistic missiles?
Yeah.
How will neighboring countries react when their airspace is suddenly violated? How will global energy markets respond in real time to a kinetic conflict in a major maritime choke point?
A volatile, highly unpredictable chain reaction forms instantly.
It does.
The analysis of the aftermath really emphasizes this loss of control. The immediate tactical goal of degrading an air defense system was achieved on February 28th, but it instantly birthed a new geopolitical reality. It altered the security posture of the entire region. Neighboring states immediately mobilized their own forces in response to the airspace incursions. The psychology of the adversary shifted from deterrence to survival.
And this loss of control isn't a failure of intelligence or planning. It is simply the physical reality of executing a war plan.
That is the ultimate paradox of using military force to ensure national security.
How so?
Well, a state takes a definitive, kinetic action to eliminate a known, calculable threat. But in the very act of eliminating it, they give birth to a dozen unknown, uncontrollable variables.
Yes.
The initial hours of the dawn strike are executed with mechanical, brilliant precision, but they immediately give way to the chaotic friction of human conflict.
It is incredible to think about the sheer weight of that choice resting on a command center.
It really is. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, and I want to make sure we distill the mechanics of this event for you, the listener.
Good idea.
We started by looking at the weeks leading up to February 28, 2026. We decoded those below-the-public threshold signals, the shifting of carrier groups, and the calibration of diplomatic back channels designed to warn an adversary without backing them into a corner.
Right. We then examined the tactical execution of the dawn strike. We explored how military planners trade strategic surprise for tactical surprise, utilizing phenomena like thermal crossover and electronic warfare to blind an integrated air defense system before the kinetic munitions ever arrive.
And we broke down the intense strategic calculus of the decision makers. The realization that they aren't looking for a perfect moment, but rather the moment when the scale tips from deterrence to degradation.
Yes.
The exact minute when the security dilemma forces their hand. And the risk of doing nothing finally outweighs the immense dangers of launching an attack.
The most important takeaway for you as you digest this analysis is how it should reframe your perspective on geopolitical events.
Absolutely.
The next time you're scrolling through the news and you see an alert about a sudden, dramatic military strike anywhere in the world, I encourage you to look past the immediate footage of the explosions.
Yeah, look deeper.
Ask yourself about the weeks of silent, agonizing signaling that preceded that exact moment. Ask yourself what radar frequencies shifted, what diplomatic phrases changed, and what threshold of risk was finally crossed in a quiet room somewhere.
It really changes how you view history as it unfolds. The data makes it clear that the strikes on February 28th were launched because the risk of inaction became too great. Planners felt they had to act to prevent a worse outcome down the road.
I did.
But here is something to consider as you go about your day. If a massive military decision is made, primarily because waiting has become too dangerous, how do leaders calculate the exact moment when the irreversible chain reaction they unleash, that tumbling line of endless dominoes, becomes an even greater threat than the one they were trying to prevent?
That's a heavy thought.
It's a question that haunts every situation room, and it's one we'll leave you to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.